Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to have David Boaz, Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute and author of The Libertarian Mind, a Manifesto for Freedom. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
David, your 1997 book, Libertarianism, a Primer, was a classic in the liberty movement, written back in the heyday of the Clinton administration. Why the update?
Well, because it was written during the Clinton administration. Things have changed. There's a lot more libertarians today. There's a lot more interest in libertarianism. You're actually seeing headlines about the libertarian wing in Congress, the libertarian faction in the Republican Party. And the book was rooted in the 1990s, before the Internet, before the financial crisis, before 9/11. So I thought we needed to update it. So a lot of the core chapters on intellectual history, individual rights, law, and economics are very much the same. But I've brought in Bush and Obama and the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street and cronyism.
Well, it's good because I've often recommended it as a primer, which was the original title, the kind of thing every college freshman should read. But speaking particularly about college freshmen, there seems to be a libertarian bent there. You cite a poll in the book, in the recent version, that 44% of Americans now define themselves as fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Where do they have a home today?
Well, that's an interesting question. And one of the points of talking about libertarianism is that I think there are millions, tens of millions of Americans who are basically fiscally conservative and socially tolerant. They don't like high taxes, and they don't see what the problem is with gay marriage. And those people don't fit well into either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the liberal or the conservative box. And I want those people to know that really the name for their point of view is libertarian. And among libertarians, of course, there's some radical, ideological, highly principled libertarians, and there are people who are a little more moderately libertarian. They're okay with legalizing marijuana and cutting taxes. They wouldn't necessarily go as far as I would on a lot of things. But that's one of the points, is to help these tens of millions of people define what part of the political spectrum they actually belong in.
Having gotten interested in libertarianism back in the 80s, it does feel more like a big tent movement now. There used to be a lot of purges and driving out of folks who didn't toe the party line. Has that changed?
Oh, I think any ideological movement has factionalism, but I think there is a larger, more visible libertarian movement that isn't so much concerned with that. And so you've got libertarians today involved in the marijuana legalization movement and in the gay marriage movement and in the Tea Party and the pushback against Obamacare, fighting for the Second Amendment rights and so on. And in all of those areas, the focus is more on moving in the direction of freedom and less on purging people who don't quite agree with you.
Well, Ralph Nader has recently made an effort to get the libertarian edge of the left and the libertarian edge of the right to talk to each other. In fact, I even think you hosted a book event for him at Cato, which I thought was kind of strange. Is he making any progress with that?
Well, we did host an event for him, and he's also spoken with Grover Norquist, the Republican taxpayer activist. But the fact is, if you read his book, he says, I want to bring all these people who oppose cronyism and war and executive overreach together. And by the way, the Cato Institute, they take money from the big corporations and the rich people. So I don't know that Ralph is as good at bringing people together as he might like to be. But yes, I do think there are several areas. If you look last year when the NSA revelations came out, and Justin Amash, who's probably the most libertarian member of the House of Representatives, had an amendment to rein in one part of NSA surveillance, not to repeal the Patriot Act or abolish the NSA or anything, but to rein in one of the worst excesses. And he ended up coming within, I forget, 10 or 20 votes of passing this on the floor of the House. But the interesting thing was he got about half the Republicans and half the Democrats. And to some extent it was.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often.
The libertarianish Republicans and the civil libertarian Democrats. And then you had the center establishment in both parties that defended the NSA doing everything it's doing.
Is it mostly going to be the Libertarians' job to cast consternation amongst the established parties, or is there a way to reform them both?
Well, I hope that they both get reformed, and I hope that libertarian ideas spread. And, I said earlier, I want all these people to know that what they really are is libertarians, whether they're moderate libertarians or strong libertarians or whatever, they're in the libertarian world. But a lot of people in America for more than 200 years have pushed for liberty without having a name, and certainly not having the name libertarian. So I do believe the people who are trying to legalize marijuana are doing a libertarian thing, however they see themselves politically. And I believe the people who are pushing back against Obamacare and gun control are doing libertarian things, even if they may call themselves conservatives or Republicans.
David, one of the things that's been very difficult for libertarians to do is capture any high ground in the academy or amongst intellectuals. Why is it that Western intellectuals are so drawn to socialism?
One of the reasons is that planning seems like an obvious thing, and it's especially an obvious thing to smart people. Accomplished people know that they didn't get to where they were. They didn't build their company. They didn't build an airline across the world. They didn't create the internet without a lot of planning. And so they naturally assume that it takes planning to do big things like running a country. And so having the insight about spontaneous order, that the biggest and most important things in life, like the economy, can't be centrally planned, is a tough thing. And it's especially tough for intellectuals whose whole life is about building systems and logically analyzing and writing plans. And I think that really causes people to see the world in those terms.
It kind of negates their MO.
Yes, that's right. That's the way they live their lives. That's the way they run the organizations they're involved with. And so they just assume that as the project gets bigger, from getting your kids to school on time, to building a school, to building an airline, to building an economy, they assume it takes more and more central planning, and that's where they're wrong. It gets too big to be planned by any authority.
Well, in your book, you call law, language, money, and markets the most important institutions in human society. And except for language, which I guess predates them all, why is it so hard to convince people that these institutions arose spontaneously?
Well, for one thing, because if you think about law, if you tell people, do you know what the law is on this, they're going to discuss what has Congress passed, what has the state legislature passed, what is the law. And they don't understand that thousands of years ago, maybe not too many thousands of years ago, people had disputes. My tree fell on your lawn. What do we do about it? Who's responsible? And the decisions in those individual cases came to be known as law. We have a precedent now.
Common law.
The precedent is we do this if my tree falls on your lawn. And you build up a body of precedents, and that was law. And it's only fairly recently that governments started stepping in and saying, no, what we pass is law, and it still sits on the body of common law. Money is the same thing. Long, long ago, our ancestors wanted to exchange things. Somebody had fruit, somebody else had fish, they could exchange. But wait, I don't like fish. Now what do we do? Well, then we need some third item that we can use as a means of exchange. And that ended up typically being gold and silver. They hold their value. They're hard for government to manipulate. And money evolved that way. And only later did kings and parliaments and Federal Reserve banks start asserting the power to actually create money. So in all of these cases, people were acting and trading and working with each other and creating money and law and language and an economy before government started being in charge.
So, David, to paraphrase a famous question, can you define libertarianism standing on one foot?
Sure. The first line of the book is, libertarianism is the philosophy of freedom. Now, we could go on and talk about it at much greater length, but the idea that people are free and government's purpose is to protect their freedom, that's libertarianism.
So, David, with libertarianism on the rise, who's its current standard bearer in Congress?
Well, I think you'd have to say that Senator Rand Paul is the most visible libertarian in our political system.
What's his chances of being our next president?
Everybody's chances of being president are less than 50-50 right now, but he's got a greater chance of being president than any libertarian in my lifetime.
David, trying to bring some of these ideas to life, I'd like to persuade you to take a walk through the pantheon of libertarian thinkers and maybe tell a story about each one. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson.
Back in the year 2000, George Will called Thomas Jefferson the man of the millennium. He said that his ideas on liberty and limited government and the right of revolution were the most important idea of the second millennium. And I think that's right. And I think Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is the most eloquent piece of libertarian writing in history. It lays out individual rights. Government is supposed to protect those rights. If government doesn't protect those rights, we retain the right to alter or abolish it. And if you read John Locke, which is much harder, and then you read the Declaration of Independence, you'll see that a lot of Jefferson's ideas really reflect directly paragraphs in John Locke about property rights and the meaning of government. But Jefferson said, I had no book at my side when I wrote this document. It wasn't my job to construct a new idea, but simply to state the American mind. And so what's in the Declaration of Independence is what the leading men of America thought about liberty and limited government at the time.
Let's roll ahead a little bit and cross the ocean to a fascinating Frenchman named Frederic Bastiat.
Bastiat was a self-taught economist and a member of Parliament, and he wrote the most amazing, clever essays explaining economics. He talked about what is seen and what is not seen. We see that every time there's a big storm, a hurricane or whatever. And the first day, the focus is on, oh, the tragedy, this is terrible. The second day, reporters start saying, oh, but this is going to be good for the economy because now there will be a lot of building. And Bastiat said, no, that's what you see. You see this activity happening because of the damage done by the storm. But what you're not accounting for is all the destruction. So it would be better if people were building new things and better things, not just rebuilding the old things. You have to look at what is seen and what is not seen. And that's true of everything that the government does. When the government gives one person money, that person looks better off. But what about the people you took the money from and what they might have done with that money? Let's
shift to Vienna. Ludwig von Mises.
For whatever reason, late in the 19th century, a school of economics arose in Vienna that was very focused not on math and numbers, but on understanding human activity, the science of human action. And Ludwig von Mises was one of the greatest figures of that enterprise. And he talked about why the market works, why socialism doesn't work. Before they even got started in the Soviet Union, he had already written this great book, Socialism, that explained why it wouldn't work. And it turned out, of course, because there were no incentives, because there was an incentive toward totalitarianism instead of production, you would get the results that the Soviet Union eventually saw. There's a wonderful story about Henry Hazlitt, who was a writer for the New York Times and who had read and written about Mises' great books, which he had written in Europe. And then Mises, fleeing the Nazis, showed up in New York, and he called Henry Hazlitt, whom he knew of, and Hazlitt said, I picked up the phone, and I heard this accented European voice saying, this is Mises speaking. And he said, it was as if I had picked up the phone and John Stuart Mill was on the line. That was how great he thought Mises was as a great liberal scholar.
And he was then even surpassed by his student Friedrich Hayek, now a star in a rock video.
Yeah. Well, whether he was surpassed is a matter of great debate among libertarians. He was certainly surpassed in terms of public recognition. Hayek got the Nobel Prize. A lot of people think Mises should have, but he didn't. Hayek became much more widely read by economists, you know, like Larry Summers from the Clinton and Obama administrations, who was the president of Harvard. People much beyond the libertarian world read Hayek and absorbed the key points that markets work, that centralized authorities can never have enough information to make better decisions than markets can make, even without necessarily accepting all of Hayek's stipulations about what kinds of government intrusion would not be superior to the market. Hayek said late in his life, when the first glimmerings of a revival of classical liberalism or libertarianism were there, Hayek said, when I was a young man, only the very old men still believed in liberalism. And now that I'm an old man, I'm so excited to see all these young men who want to read my books and come and talk to me about liberalism.
It does seem like a trend. Let me give you a more challenging one, a woman who would declare vociferously that she was not a libertarian, Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand did say she was not a libertarian. She called herself an objectivist, but she had a great story. She was born in pre-revolutionary Russia in St. Petersburg to a prosperous Jewish family. And she began to develop by reading and by watching American movies. She began to develop essentially liberal or libertarian ideas. And then the communists came and Russia was turned into a, not yet a socialist hellhole, but it was on that way. And she wanted to get out, and she did manage to get out, and she got to America, and she got to Hollywood and became a screenwriter, and eventually wrote the best-selling novels of ideas in probably American history, and created a whole movement of people who held libertarian ideas but insisted that they were not libertarian.
A somewhat cultish movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, some people in it might have treated it as a cultish movement, but millions of people read the books, and only thousands became part of any cult movement. Millions of people were inspired by the book's emphasis on individualism and production and achievement, and your right to have a successful life here on this earth. One of the things she challenged was the idea that you should live your life so that God would take you to heaven eventually. She said, you have a right to be happy here on earth. And so her focus was less on politics and more on flourishing as a human being. But when she talked about politics, she believed in individual rights and limited government, and like it or not, that makes her a libertarian.
Well, ticking off some of the many characters you cover in your book, here's the first one that I've met, which is Milton Friedman.
And Milton Friedman was probably the most visible, active advocate of libertarian ideas in the last third of the 20th century. He was a Nobel-quality economist and a Nobel-quality communicator, and that's a really rare thing. He had a column in Newsweek. He did a very popular public television show, Free to Choose. If you look at issues from the military draft to monetary policy to free trade to school choice to drug legalization, he was a key scholar and or a key advocate in all of those, and very few academic scholars touch so many public issues.
So that covers the past. Who do you consider today's leading lights of libertarian thought?
You know, that is a much harder question because it sort of takes time to see who the greatest thinkers are. But let's say that I think the legal scholarship of Richard Epstein and Randy Barnett will be read for a long time and is an important contribution. Some young philosophers like Michael Huemer and David Schmitz, I think, are doing valuable work there. Lots of think tank people are advancing libertarian ideas in terms of public policy. That's not quite the same thing as building a doctrine, building a body of work that will be read for 100 years.
Well, let's move into the activist realm then and look at the front lines of the libertarian movement. There's talk that libertarians are trying to take over the Republican Party, purge the social conservatives, the religious conservatives, and actually win political power. Do they stand a chance?
Well, I doubt there's going to be any mass purge of big factions of the Republican Party. I do think this is the first time that I can remember that people are talking about the libertarian wing and even the non-interventionist wing of the Republican Party. And I think Ron Paul's 2 presidential campaigns and now Rand Paul's likely presidential campaign are really galvanizing a lot of that talk. But you are seeing Republicans in Congress pushing back against big government ideas like Obamacare more than they did in the past, and also questioning our endless wars in the Middle East and the whole philosophy of foreign military interventionism. So there is something going on there. Is Rand Paul likely to be the presidential nominee? Well, there's a whole lot of Republican candidates, not to mention a few Democratic candidates, so the likelihood of any one of them being the nominee is certainly less than 50-50. But he's in the mix, and he's even a front runner in New Hampshire in a way that libertarians have never been before.
Many people say he could mass enough appeal to put on a good showing and even win the general election, but he'll never get through the primaries because those are controlled by the social conservatives. What do you think about that?
There's certainly a plausible argument for that. He is talking about a lot of issues like being more skeptical of military intervention, like criminal justice reform, like reining in the NSA and its surveillance powers. All of those things would bring in new voters in a general election, but may be tough to get voters to come into Republican primaries. So, yeah, that's a challenge. Certainly one of the arguments he will want to make as he runs in the Republican primaries will be, I'm the guy who can take the Republican vote beyond the 45% that everybody else can get.
Is it likely that Rand Paul will start compromising his principles to win the prize?
Everybody in politics compromises their principles if they have any principles. Now, with a lot of politicians, it's not at all obvious if they had anything they were trading off. But sure, if you're trying to get 51% of the Republican Party or 51% of the general election, you're probably not going to talk about every idea that you have. And I don't know Rand Paul's heart. I don't know whether he agrees with every radical belief that I have. But what I see from his public actions is a guy who wants government to be much smaller, to do many fewer things for the people so the people can do for themselves, who wants taxes to be lower, who wants the NSA to spy on us less, who wants to put fewer people in jail, who wants to let people out of jail rather than having them rot there forever. In all of those ways, he wants to move in a libertarian direction. If he was dictator, would he move as far as I would if I was dictator? Well, you don't want either one of us to be a dictator, so don't worry about that.
David, as you know, I struggle with pessimism, and a lot of people who are libertarians at heart think we're on the road to serfdom. What's going to turn it around?
The fact that freedom works is going to turn it around. I mean, we can point to a whole lot of things, higher entitlement spending, the NSA spying, the nanny state stuff, all of those things, and it's easy to think we're on the road to serfdom. But the fact is, I think, if you look at history, when was the time we were so much freer? Back before the Civil War when we had slavery? I don't think so. After the Civil War when we had Jim Crow and women weren't allowed to own property in their own names and conduct contracts? During the 1950s when we had the military draft and 90% income tax rates? I think if you add it all up, freedom works. Eventually people see that, and especially if you look worldwide today, more people in the world today are in a world of broadly property rights, market exchange, human rights, women's rights, globalization than ever before in the history of the world. So I am optimistic that markets and property rights and religious freedom and women's rights will continue to impress people as the right way to go. And so I am optimistic. And I say at the end of the book, I am a progressive and an optimist, and I believe that we are making progress and that we will continue to make progress, though we will certainly have setbacks along the way.
David, thank you for the pick-me-up, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
That was David Boaz, Executive Vice President at the Cato Institute and author of The Libertarian Mind, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. A special invitation for our Boston listeners: come join me Saturday, February 21st, when I'll be keynoting the Young Americans for Liberty Massachusetts State Convention at Harvard. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.